Hey everybody, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that helps you get more out of movies, and today we're going to be talking about 20 underrated movies currently included with Prime Video. So all of the movies I'm going to be talking about are currently included with your Prime Video membership, but that will not always be the case. So if you're new to the channel, definitely click the subscribe button and that little bell icon. That way you get notified when these videos are new so you don't miss the movies before they're gone. But this is going to be a ranked list from my weakest recommendation all the way to my strongest. We're going to start this list off all the way at the back with a Woody Harrelson superhero movie that very few people seem to know about called Defendor. Now, on the surface, this has a lot in common with Kick-Ass, which is actually also included with Prime Video right now. But in Defendor, Woody Harrelson plays a very delusional vigilante superhero. And even though the concept does have quite a lot in common with Kick-Ass, the tone is very different. Here, Woody Harrelson's character is so delusional, he creates all these really weak weapons like lime juice and a little jar full of wasps. And all the supporting cast play things very, very straight, even though he's so bizarre and offbeat, and that's what makes this movie work. His performance is really funny, and then you get some other really good actors reacting to him kind of the way you and I might. But this is a very low budget movie. It does show it's one of the lower budget things I've seen Woody Harrelson in a really long time. But for fans of Harrelson, this is going to be a must watch, especially if you've never heard of it. Now we'll change things up quite a bit with my next pick, which is loaded with visual effects, and it just didn't quite do well with critics or the box office, but I still consider Push to be highly underrated, especially if you go into it with the right expectations. Now, this stars Chris Evans and Dakota Fanning, so I think right there is where some of the negative reviews come in, because this movie is a little bit beneath both of them in terms of their, overall filmography, especially now after Chris Evans has had such an amazing career. But this is a cool sci-fi flick about some people with some special abilities. It never quite gets to where you want it to be, which is why it's my number 19 pick, but the movie's beautifully shot, it's got a great color palette and a really good sensibility to it. The story just gets a little muddled and lost along the way. A lot of that comes from just being PG-13, it gets hamstrung a little bit, doesn't quite go for the jugular the way that it could have. Again, that's why it's my number 19 pick, but still a really cool sci-fi flick, especially if you've never seen it. I know a lot of you probably watched and enjoyed The Tragedy of Macbeth with Denzel Washington, but there is another Macbeth adaptation that is really interesting. It's called Scotland, PA, but in this one, no one's speaking Shakespearean language. Scotland, PA revolves around a fast food restaurant in the 70s in suburban Pennsylvania. But all the characters are represented here. The story of Macbeth is also represented fairly well. It gets a little lost here and there with some of the comedy, but that's also what makes Scotland, PA kind of cool. It's got this interesting take. It has a lot of fun with that story, with a lot of familiar faces too. In no way, shape, or form would Scotland, PA be a good replacement for the original Macbeth, whether you're reading it or watching it sort of portrayed in its close to original form. However, if you are familiar with the story and you like Macbeth, this is a really interesting way to take it in. Now, my next pick stars Bruce Campbell and was actually written by Sam Raimi, who's most famous for creating the Evil Dead series. I guess he's also really famous for the first couple of Spider-Man movies, but this one's actually directed by Bruce Campbell, and it's the only feature film he ever directed. And while I can kind of see why, I still really enjoy Man with the Screaming Brain. Now, this looks to have an even lower budget than Defendor, which kind of is part of its charm, but you get classic Bruce Campbell here with some really sloppy but fun visual effects, including a brain that is just basically on the loose. Now, similar to Defendor, I really only recommend this for Bruce Campbell fans, but also people who just love good like midnight movies, B movies. If you love riff tracks or Mystery Science Theater 3000, this one doesn't have a commentary track, obviously, but it is a movie done in that vein. It's a ton of fun to watch, especially if you're into that sort of thing. And then we'll jump to my number 16 pick, which is more of a crowd pleaser. It's a lot less niche than some of the other ones I've been talking about, but Standard was actually on a Tubi list that I recently put out. If you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link in the video description down below. But in this movie, Thomas Jane plays Andre Stander, who was a South African police officer who became a bank robber. So this is basically a heist movie, but it's also a little bit of a biography of this guy. It's the story of how he went from one world to the other. So that's very interesting, but you get some great bank robberies out of it as well. It's got a cool 70s vibe and soundtrack and some decent action. I wouldn't quite call this an action movie. It is more of a straightforward drama, but it does have that heist element, so all that stuff's fantastic. And the fact that this is all based on a true story makes it even more interesting. So over the past few years, Donald Glover has basically become a household name. If that name's not familiar, then maybe you're familiar with Childish Gambino. I mean, he's won multiple Grammys. I think he's won Grammys. He's also famous for creating Atlanta on FX, so a lot of hit stuff. But before all that, he was a comedy writer and actually did a lot of sketch comedy, and with some of his friends, he made a movie called Mystery Team, which I find to be absolutely hilarious. In this movie, he and his friends are all high school seniors that have essentially never grown up, and they're still riding their bikes around town solving dinky mysteries, yet they get thrust into this really adult investigation, and it makes for some really funny moments, like a bunch of 18-year-old boys showing up to a gentleman's club and not really understanding what they're getting into, stuff like that. He's really funny, a lot of the other guys are great. There's a lot of laughs in this, especially if you're a fan of his, and I can guarantee there are people watching that are a big fan of his music that didn't even know this movie existed. However, if you like really silly comedies, this should be right up your alley.
Where did you find this?
It's a long story.
No, it's not. A stripper peed it into a toilet. And
Hey! Shut up.
Okay, my number 14 pick is not actually a feature film. It only runs about 45 minutes, but I have not seen it available in forever, so I'm excited to talk about The Monster Maker. This is actually from Jim Henson Studios, and it's about a young boy who discovers this giant dragon-like animatronic creature that may or may not actually have some life to it. Now, it's as cool as it looks. Obviously, it is pretty dated, but this also has a lot in common with Jim Henson's The Storyteller, which is also currently available on Prime Video. Now, that is a series, but it is an amazing one. With that, you get a lot of these shorts narrated by John Hurt with this just amazing production design. And while The Monster Maker isn't the same thing, it does go hand in hand, and those could all make for great viewing experiences, especially if you grew up with them like I did, or if you've got kids that are getting tired of watching the same things over and over again on Netflix. The Storyteller and The Monster Maker could both be a great way to go for you and your family. Now, one to not watch with the kids or the family is The Missing. This is actually directed by Ron Howard and stars Tommy Lee Jones and Cate Blanchett. In this movie, Cate Blanchett's daughter is kidnapped and Tommy Lee Jones has to go on the hunt. So it's pretty typical format, but you get a great Western with some beautiful cinematography. However, if you're in the mood for a classic Western, this is not necessarily going to be the pick for you. While it is very, very good, this is more of a drama about a missing child and doesn't have a lot of the beats that a typical Western would. So just go into it with the right mindset. It's not a happy movie by any means, but it is one that I think is pretty accessible for mass audiences. Now, my next pick is one of the newest ones on this list. It's only about a year old. It stars Tom Hardy playing Al Capone and is somehow still criminally underrated. But I can kind of see why, and I will explain. In Capone, Tom Hardy is playing an Al Capone that is at the end of his life. If you don't know, Al Capone suffered from syphilis, and after he was released from jail, he lived down in Florida. And this movie really explores the idea of his brain deteriorating on him. He starts to lose track of things, he's not sure what's really happening, and the violent life that he led up to that point really comes back to haunt him in a very interesting way. Now, story-wise, it's actually a little bit thin because it's a little bit more of an experience, but what you get is not only a really interesting performance from Tom Hardy, but you get some scenes that are like something out of The Shining. It's a wild juxtaposition to get this this gangster thing, and there's almost like a horror movie at times. So I get why people didn't love it. They maybe had some expectations of what this was gonna be, maybe a story about Al Capone. You're not gonna get really any of the stuff that you would expect in this movie. You're not gonna get Al Capone running moonshine or anything like that. He's a frail old man in this, but that is what makes it interesting, and I think a lot of this really comes down to expectations. You go into Capone with the right expectations, and it's a pretty wild ride. And then we will wrap up my bottom 10 on this list with 13 Hours, one that I think was criminally underrated when it was released. I know there was a lot of political stink about this one back when it was released, so half of the US population didn't care to watch it. However, this is directed by Michael Bay, who's obviously most famous for Transformers, Bad Boys, Armageddon, real wild action movies. But 13 Hours accurately displays the events as they unfold during the attack on the American embassy in Benghazi. Now, typically with Michael Bay, the story takes a back seat to all of the dazzling visual effects with movies like the Transformers. However, with his smaller, lower budget movies like 13 Hours, he does not do many, but the story never really seems to get lost with these. He seems to do a much better job when he's not so busy trying to make all the big special effects work. So 13 Hours, I think, does a great job at laying things out. In fact, watching this, I was reminded a lot of my experience watching Black Hawk Down for the first time. I wouldn't quite say 13 Hours is as good as Black Hawk Down, and maybe isn't gonna hold up the way Black Hawk Down has over the years, but it has a lot in common. I think if you're a fan of that movie, you should definitely check out 13 Hours if you passed on it. In fact, this might be Michael Bay's most successful movie in terms of storytelling. But speaking of storytelling, and before we get on to my top 10 picks on this list, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Now in 2022, I've got quite a few resolutions, but one of them is to actually learn After Effects, which is going to help me create some interesting graphics on my videos. I'd also like to become a better video editor. I had no experience editing videos before starting on YouTube. I've learned everything by watching videos, and I've learned everything mostly by watching videos on YouTube. And while that did work for me and it's a great way to go, it can be exhausting. You can watch multiple videos before you find the right one, or at least before you find the right host that you can understand. But Skillshare is an online community I recently joined, and I'm taking classes on how to do some of these things I've always wanted to do. And not only does Skillshare have a seemingly endless amount of classes to choose from, they've got a fantastic filter system that is going to allow you to easily filter things down and pick out the things that are most relevant to you, saving you a lot of time. I find that feature to be one of the best things about Skillshare, second to just the quality of the courses included. All the videos are ad-free, so you can stay focused on what you're learning, and they also are curated. They're not just letting anyone put things up. These are very, very good videos with great introductions that explain what you're going to be getting into very quickly and concisely, which is important for me. And with new premium classes released every week, there's always something new to learn on Skillshare. And you can learn graphic design, painting, drawing, self-improvement. I mentioned storytelling. I may or may not currently be working on a screenplay. Skillshare has some classes that are going to help me with that as well. And right now, the first 1,000 people that go to the link in the description below are going to get a free month of Skillshare. That's a free month, not a free video. That means you could learn a ton of stuff in the first 30 days without spending a dime. So whether you're a freelancer, an entrepreneur like me, or you're just looking for some self-improvement, I highly recommend checking out the link in the description below and getting your free month so you can learn a bunch of new stuff in 2022. But let's go ahead and move on with the top 10 picks on this list.
Hey, buddy. I got the good stuff.
Put your hands on the car! Put your hands on the car!
Think this is funny?
No, sir! No, sir!
My number 10 pick is Colombiana, starring Zoe Saldana. Now, this is another one that is PG-13 and I think got a little bit hamstrung by it. It really could have been better if it were rated R, but, and it's kind of a big but, Colombiana is surprisingly violent for a PG-13 movie, meaning there's a surprising amount of blood and a surprising amount of bullets hitting bodies. In this movie, Zoe Saldana plays I guess what we'll call a hit woman. And Colombiana is pretty much by the book. It's a formulaic thing, but not only is Zoe Saldana great, I mean, she's great in everything, but she really carries this movie. The movie does have some really interesting sequences of assassinations, shootouts, things like that. It's not just mindless bullets flying back and forth. Some of that's in there, but you do get a little bit more. And even though these femme fatale movies are kind of a dime a dozen, especially PG-13 ones for some reason, I found Colombiana to be exceptional, especially considering they didn't have an R rating to work with. They got a lot of killing done in this movie. Now my next pick has an R rating even though it has no killing in it, which is kind of unusual. And even though 127 Hours did get a lot of recognition when it was released, I think it was nominated for Best Picture that year, it has been forgotten with time, and I think it's still an exceptional movie. Now this is actually from director Danny Boyle, who's directed a bunch of my favorite movies, including Trainspotting. And while this isn't my favorite movie of his, and really not my favorite James Franco movie either, it is an amazing story. I remember when this actually happened. The guy who actually cut his arm off in this situation, he was on the news, he even appeared on Letterman once. And it is a harrowing story that makes you sort of look at yourself and what you would do in that situation. But if you're unfamiliar, this is the story of Aaron Ralston, who was mountain climbing on his own and became trapped by a boulder. It pinned his arm, and while he starved there for days, he eventually got the nerve to cut his own arm off with a dull pocket knife. And that is where the R rating comes in this movie. Considering you're literally pinned between a rock and a hard place with James Franco for about 90 minutes, the movie moves and it manages to work really well. It's compelling and it's worth multiple watches. If you've never seen this one, it's expertly done, and I think not required viewing for the filmmaking, but just required viewing for taking in this story and making sure it's kind of part of your DNA and that you know that this is something that people are capable of. I don't know, I find that to be really interesting. Now we're going to change things up quite a bit with my number 8 pick, which is a sequel from the 90s, and it's not the best sequel of all time. In fact, it kind of pales in comparison to the original. However, I still consider Predator 2 to be highly underrated. Now, I give this movie major points for having the balls to do something very different, and I don't mean just different from other movies, I mean very different from Predator. Predator was a hit movie, and it still holds up today incredibly well, and instead of retreading the same thing with a sequel and trying to make money, they did something completely different, and while it doesn't quite work in total, I think a lot of things about this movie do, which is why I consider it to be severely underrated. Now here, Danny Glover is the hero, he does a great job, and you get sort of this urban thing with Predator running around through buildings. Story-wise, it's a little thin, but what I love about Predator 2 is it's got a lot of good moments in it. Bill Paxton has an over-the-top role like he usually does in these movies, and it takes place in the near future, or at least the near future compared to the early 90s when this movie came out. It's got a cool look to it. It looks like it's of the 90s, but not from the 90s. Gangs have sort of overrun Los Angeles, and it's got this interesting vibe to it, and then it is ultimately devolves into this Predator movie that kind of doesn't stop. There's this big chase sequence that is broken up, but it just continues, and it's pretty wild stuff. And out of all the Predator and Alien vs. Predator movies, I gotta say, Predator 2 comes in second to Predator 1 for me. My next pick stars Denzel Washington and was directed by Tony Scott, who's most famous for directing movies like Crimson Tide, again with Denzel Washington, but also Top Gun, and for some reason, Deja Vu is just not held up with time. Now don't get me wrong, I think the movie itself holds up. The filmmaking, the acting, the look of it, all of that still feels fresh, but for some reason this movie just has not been remembered with time, despite the fact that it is a really interesting take on time travel. Now, the less you know about the time travel elements, the better. I would go into this with very minimal expectations in terms of time travel, as those elements aren't only somewhat subtle, they're very different from what you're going to expect them to be, at least in how they function, but you get an interesting role from Denzel Washington, as always, but the action in this movie looks particularly good. It looks grungy, it looks real. That has a lot to do with the way Tony Scott used to direct movies. They were all very fast-paced. Just the way they actually film them. They'd be quick, fast-paced, and have a lot of energy as a result. And there really is nothing else that quite feels like a Tony Scott movie. He brings this electricity to the screen in a way that really nobody else does, especially at this point in his career. While this isn't the best one that he made like this, I would have said Man on Fire was probably better and it came out a few years prior. Still, this is him right at his peak, where he's bringing some really wild elements on screen, like as a filmmaker, yet he's still managing to keep everything tied together really well, and he's still telling a really good story, even though it feels like chaos. Now my next pick is another somewhat recent release. It came out during the pandemic, and it's got a pretty killer cast with people like John Malkovich, Vince Vaughn, and Liam Hemsworth in Arkansas.
'Cause everything that glitters is not gold. Come on back with the Gatlin.
Clark Duke also stars in this, but more interestingly, he wrote and directed this. This is his first big feature film, and I love what he did with this movie. One key thing is that I'm from the South, I live in Atlanta, I'm from Mississippi, and this obviously takes place in Arkansas, but it is a very Southern movie. Clark Duke himself is from the South originally, and you can tell he's got a real affinity for this region, and it comes to life on screen in a way that I haven't really seen before. Typically, the South is parodied, and it's portrayed by people who really don't have it in their blood the way that me and Clark Duke apparently do, and I really appreciated that. There's a lot of subtle elements to Arkansas that feel very genuine, and it develops into this epic gangster thing that spans multiple decades, which I did not see coming, and I loved it for that. This is also one of the last movies Michael Kenneth Williams was in before he died, so if you're a fan of his, this is going to be a must-watch for you. But I'll also say, if you've liked Vince Vaughn over the years, this is a must-watch. He's doing something very different in this movie than you've ever seen him do, and I had a blast watching him do it. Now my next pick is from Japan. It's Japanese language. You will have to read subtitles, and it's from director Takashi Miike, who I talked about in a recent video with Blade of the Immortal, which is also a great bloodbath sort of samurai thing you can currently check out, included with Prime Video. But First Love is a modern day gangster flick, and in this movie, a boxer and a call girl get wrapped up into this gang war over one night in Tokyo. And First Love is well written, the characters are really strong, and it feels pretty straightforward for about half the movie, and then it turns into this epic gangster battle that just does not seem to quit. I did talk about Takashi Miike and his other movies. He is famous for bloodbath movies like 13 Assassins and Ichi the Killer, and while First Love is not his best movie, it's one of his more recent ones, and it is really wild. Now my number 4 pick is Apocalypto. It's one a lot of you should be familiar with by now, but I bet a lot of you also forgot how good and interesting this movie actually is. Now this movie depicts the Mayan kingdom, basically, and it depicts it sort of at its decline. Now what I found so interesting about this movie is it really focuses on one person, I guess what we'll call a warrior, that is kidnapped, enslaved, and set up to sacrifice, and then it turns into this non-stop adventure. It's got an incredible pace to it and an incredible production design. This looks real, it looks authentic. A lot of the actors they used had never really worked before. They're all doing amazing work. Obviously this is, I don't even know if you call it foreign language. This is in a dead language that isn't used anymore. And while the story of Apocalypto is in no way historically accurate, there's a lot of things out of place with it, it does convey a story very, very well with minimal dialogue, or at least most of the story is conveyed to you visually, which just works so well in this movie. Mel Gibson, say what you will about him, he is an incredible director. I wish he was making movies behind the camera more than he's making them in front of the camera, because he does a much better job these days back behind it. But Apocalypto just really stands out as something sort of special and unique unto itself. Now we'll step things up quite a bit with my number 3 pick, which is a World War II movie about snipers called Enemy at the Gates. This stars Jude Law and is exceptional. It got a little overshadowed by some other movies like Saving Private Ryan and The Thin Red Line, both released around the same time, both of which are currently included with Prime Video, by the way. This also makes a great companion to those. It is exceptionally done. In this movie, a Russian sniper played by Jude Law and a German sniper played by Ed Harris are essentially playing a game of cat and mouse with each other during the Battle of Stalingrad. Now the movie very accurately depicts the Battle of Stalingrad at times. The sets and everything all look incredibly authentic. I would say production-wise, this is almost as good as Saving Private Ryan. It's very, very close. And accuracy-wise, the way that some of these sniper shots are carried out are all really accurate. Now, it is a movie, there's some over-the-top stuff that's not quite realistic, but for the most part, the movie itself is fairly grounded, and it makes for a really fantastic World War II movie, again, that is just a great companion to The Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan. My number 2 pick is a Christopher Nolan movie. It's one of my favorites of his, and for some reason I just feel like time has forgotten about The Prestige. This came out between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and while I don't think it's as good as The Dark Knight, I do think it is one of the better Christopher Nolan movies in terms of the way it delivers the story. So a lot of complaints with Christopher Nolan movies lately are that they're maybe a little messy or hard to understand, and while The Prestige is very complicated and has a lot of twists and turns, Christopher Nolan did a really good job of conveying a lot of the details. And not only do you get these dueling magicians trying to one-up each other, you also get Nikola Tesla, played by David Bowie, which was not only just an amazing choice, David Bowie did an amazing job playing this character. You also get a great role from Scarlett Johansson, Michael Caine. There's so many great layers to this one, and again, it works really well as a story. More so than a lot of other Christopher Nolan movies do, and I'm a big fan of his work. Now, I talked about Enemy of the Gates turning into sort of a cat and mouse thing, but one of the best cat and mouse movies I've ever seen comes from South Korea. It's called I Saw the Devil. Now, this is a movie about a vicious serial killer. This has a lot in common with movies like Silence of the Lambs, but where this movie differs is a secret agent is actually chasing this serial killer down, and there is a series of captures and releases, and it's really wild stuff. And in no way would I call this a martial arts movie, but you are dealing with a secret agent in South Korea, so there is quite a bit of action in this movie for a serial killer movie, making it incredibly well-rounded. There's so many different elements here, and it's quite long. It's about 2.5 hours long. You will have to read subtitles, but if you like anything about the way I've described I Saw the Devil, I highly recommend it, which is why it's my number 1 pick. That is the list. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything else interesting you've seen lately that you want to let the community know about. Who knows, your recommendation might make it onto a future video. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a Patreon supporter by clicking the link in the description below, and you'll get to see your name here at the end of every video. And don't forget to check out that Skillshare link in the description box below. That way you can get your free month and take a bunch of classes at no charge. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Prime Video episode, and you will see me on the next one.